James Roland Angell, 1869 to 1949. James Roland Angell molded the functionalist movement into a working school of thought. He made the psychology department at the University of Chicago the most influential of its days, as well as the major training ground for functional psychologists. Angell was born into an academic family in Vermont. His grandfather had been president of Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and his father was president of the University of Vermont and later the University of Michigan. Angell completed his undergraduate work at Michigan, where he studied under John Dewey. He also read William James's The Principles of Psychology, which he said influenced his thinking more than any other book he had ever read. Angell worked with James for a year at Harvard and received his master's degree in 1892. He then went to Europe to continue his graduate studies at the universities in Halle and in Berlin, in Germany. At Berlin, he attended lectures by Ebbinghaus and Helmholtz. He hoped to go on to Leipzig, but Wundt would not accept any more students that year. Angell was unable to complete the work for his doctoral degree. His dissertation was accepted with the condition that he rewrite it in better German, but to do so, he would have had to remain at Halle without any source of income. He decided instead to accept an employment at the University of Minnesota, where the salary, though low, was better than nothing, particularly for a young man eager to end a 4-year engagement and get married. Although he never earned a PhD, Angell was instrumental in granting many doctorates. This is shocking. And in the course of his career, he received 23 honorary degrees. After a year at Minnesota, Angell accepted a position at the University of Chicago, where he remained for 25 years. Of course, now you're sure are not going to get a position at a community college, even if you have a master's degree. And you sure are not going to get a position at a university unless you have a PhD. But anyway, following in the family tradition, he then became president of Yale. In 1906, he was elected the 15th president of the APA. Doesn't have a PhD, and yet he's the elected president of the APA, and he's president of Yale. After retiring from academic life, he served on the board of the National Broadcasting Company, the NBC. Angell was described by Time magazine and others who knew him as the chipper, bouncy little man, the life of the party. His nickname at the University of Chicago was Sonny Jim. It was also widely believed that it was unwise to talk or drive with him because of his ineradicable habit of jaywalking across traffic-riddled streets. Stoplights mean nothing to him. With the same reckless assurance and incredible skill, he drives his car. Angell's textbook, Psychology, written in 1904, embodies the functionalist approach. The book was so successful that it appeared in 4 editions in 4 years, indicating the appeal of the functionalist position. In that book, Angell noted that the function of consciousness is to improve the organism's adaptive abilities. The goal of psychology is to study how the mind assists the organism in adjusting to its environment. In Angell's 1906 presidential address to the APA, he outlined what he called the, quote, province of functional psychology, end quote. We noted previously that new movements gain vitality and momentum only with reference to or in opposition to the currently popular position. Angell drew the battle lines sharply, but concluded with modesty, quote, I formally renounce any intention to strike out new plans. I am engaged in what is meant as a dispassionate summary of actual conditions, end quote. Functional psychology, Angell said, was not at all new, but had been a significant part of psychology from the earliest times. It was structural psychology that had itself apart from the older and more pervasive functional form of psychology. Angell then described the 3 major themes of the functionalist movement. They are as follows. First, functional psychology is the psychology of mental operations, in contrast to structuralism, which is the psychology of mental elements. Titchener's elementistic approach still had its supporters, and Angell was promoting functionalism in direct opposition to it. The task of functionalism is to discover how a mental process operates. what it accomplishes, and under what conditions it occurs. Second, functional psychology is the psychology of the fundamental utilities of consciousness. Thus, consciousness is used in a utilitarian spirit as it mediates between the needs of the organism and the demands of the environment. Structures and functions of the organism exist because they allow the organism to adapt to its environment and thus to survive. Angell suggested that because consciousness has survived, it must therefore perform some essential service for the organism. Functional psychologists need to discover precisely what this service of consciousness is for the organism. Third, functional psychology is the psychology of psychophysical relations, or mind-body relations, and is concerned with the total relationship of the organism to its environment. Functionalism encompasses all mind-body functions and recognizes no real distinction between mind and body. They see them as a coherent whole. It considers them as belonging to the same order and assumes an easy transfer from one to the other. Angell's APA address was delivered at a time when the spirit of functionalism was already widely accepted in the United States. Angell shaped that spirit into a prominent active enterprise with a laboratory, a body of research data, an enthusiastic staff of teachers, and a dedicated corps of graduate students. In gilding functionism to the status of a formal school, he gave it the focus and stature to make it effective. However, he continued to insist that functionalism did not constitute a separate school of thought and should not become identified exclusively with the University of Chicago. Despite Angell's disclaimers, functionalism flourished and continued to be referred to as the Chicago School, permanently associating it with the kind of philosophy taught and practiced there. We noted that there was not a single form of functional psychology, as there was a structural psychology, although the primary development and founding of the functionalist school of thought occurred at the University of Chicago. Another approach was being shaped by Robert Woodworth at Columbia University. Columbia University was also the academic base for two other psychologists with a functional orientation. One was called James McKeen Cattell, whose work on mental tests embodied the American functionalist spirit, and the other was E.L. Thorndike, whose research on problems of animal learning reinforced the functionalist trend toward greater objectivity. Now we get to Robert Sessions Wordsworth, 1869 to 1962. Woodworth did not belong formally to the functionalist school. He disliked the constraints imposed by membership in any school of thought. Nevertheless, much of what Woodworth wrote about psychology was in the functionalist spirit of the Chicago School, and he added an important point of view. So Wordsworth, I have a copy of his first edition of An Introduction to Psychology, or Psychology, An Introduction to Mental Life. And that's the reason why I wanted to go into psychology, is from reading Wordsworth's book in psychology. So, Wordsworth was active in psychology for more than 60 years as a researcher, beloved teacher, writer, and editor. After receiving his bachelor's degree from Amherst College in Massachusetts, he taught high school science and then mathematics at a small college. Then, two experiences changed his life. First, he heard G. Stanley Hall give a talk. Second, he read William James's The Principles of Psychology. He then decided that he had to become a psychologist. He enrolled at Harvard University, where he earned his master's degree, and then he received his PhD in 1899 from James McKeen Cattell at Columbia University. Woodworth taught physiology in New York City hospitals for 3 years and spent another year working in England with the physiologist Charles Scott Sherrington. He returned to Columbia University in 1903, where he taught until his first retirement in 1945. He was so popular with the students at Columbia University that he continued to lecture to large classes until he retired a second time at the age of 89. A former student, Gardner Murphy, remembered Woodworth as the best teacher he ever had in a psychology course. As Murphy described it, Woodworth entered the classroom, quote, in an unpressed, baggy old suit and wearing army shoes, end quote. He would walk to the blackboard and, quote, utter some imitable words of insight or whimsy, which would go into our notebooks to be remembered in the decades that followed, end quote. Woodworth described his view of psychology in several journal articles and in two books, Dynamic Psychology in 1918 and Dynamics of Behavior in 1958. He wrote an introductory text, Psychology, in 1921, which appeared in 5 editions in 25 years and is said to have outsold every other psychology text of its time. Of course, this is the psychology text that I first read, the first edition being published in 1921. In 1956, Woodworth received the first gold medal award from the American Psychological Foundation for, quote, unequaled contributions to shaping the destiny of scientific psychology. As an integrator and organizer of psychological knowledge. So Woodworth maintained that his approach to psychology was not really new, but was the one that good psychologists had followed even in the days before psychology became an actual science. Psychological knowledge must begin with an investigation of the nature of the stimulus and the response, that is, with objective external events. But when psychologists consider only the stimulus and the response in attempting to explain behavior, they miss out what may be the most important part of their study, the living organism itself. A stimulus is not the complete cause of a particular response. The organism, with its varying energy levels and its current and past experiences, also acts to determine the response. Psychology must consider the organism as interpolated between the stimulus and the response. Therefore, Woodworth suggested the subject matter for psychology must be both consciousness and behavior. This position was adopted later by the humanistic psychologists and the social learning theorists. The external stimulus as well as the organism's overt response may be observed objectively, but what occurs inside the organism can be known only through introspection. Thus, Woodworth accepted introspection as a useful tool for psychology, along with observational and experimental methods. Woodworth introduced into functionalism a dynamic psychology that elaborated on the teachings of John Dewey and William James. Dewey had used the word dynamic in this context as early as 1884 and James in 1908. A dynamic psychology is concerned with motivation. Woodworth's intention was to develop what he called a motivology. And so dynamic psychology was Robert Woodworth's system of psychology, which was concerned with the influence of causal factors and motivations on feelings and behaviors. Although we can find similarities between Woodworth's position and that of the Chicago functionalists, Woodworth emphasized the physiological elements and events that underlie the behavior. His dynamic psychology focused on cause and effect relationships, and his primary interest was in the forces that drive or motivate human beings. He believed that psychology's goal would be to determine why people behave as they do. Woodworth did not adhere to a single system, nor did he want to develop his own school of thought. His viewpoint was constructed not out of protest, but by extending, elaborating, and synthesizing what he considered to be useful features of other approaches. Attacks on the functionalist movement came quickly and vehemently from the structuralists. From the first time, at least in the United States, the new psychology was divided into warring factions. You had on one side Titchener's laboratory at Cornell for the structuralist camp, and the psychology department at the Chicago School for the functionalist camp. Accusations, charges, and countercharges flew back and forth between the enemies with the righteousness typical of those convinced they alone possessed the truth. So we have a rivalry between Cornell's structuralist and Chicago's functionalist. Titchener and his followers argue that functionalism was not psychology at all. Why? Because functionalism did not adhere to structuralism's subject matter and methods. Thus, in Titchener's view, any approach to psychology that deviated from the introspective analysis of the mind into elements could not truly be called psychology. Of course, it was just this definition of psychology that the functionalists were questioning. Structuralists also found fault with the functional psychologist's interest in practical concerns, thus reawakening the long-standing controversy between pure and applied science. Structuralists didn't care about the practical and the things that could be applied to society. The functionalists did. The structuralists disdained any application of psychological knowledge to real-world problems, whereas the functionalists had no interest in maintaining psychology as a pure science and never apologized for their practical interests. The functionalists argued that both pure and applied psychology could adhere to rigorous scientific procedures, and that valid research could be performed in factories, offices, and classrooms, just as well as in university laboratories. It is the method and not the subject matter that determines the scientific worth of any field of inquiry, they argued. So it is the method that determines the scientific worth of a field of inquiry, not the subject matter. Structuralists were more concerned on the subject matter. They didn't care about institutions, organizations. The dispute between pure and applied science is no longer a serious issue, however, in American psychology, largely because applied psychology has become so pervasive. This practical application of psychology to real-life problems is among functionalism's most important and lasting contributions of endeavor. Functionalism's vigorous opposition to structuralism had an immense impact on the development of psychology in the United States. Long-range consequences of the shift in emphasis from structure to function were also significant. One result was that research on animal behavior, which was not part of the structuralist approach, became a vital area of study for psychology. The functionalist, broadly based psychology also incorporated studies of infants, children, and people with mental disabilities. Functional psychologists supplemented the introspective method with data obtained from other methods such as physiological research, mental tests, questionnaires, and objective descriptions of behavior. These approaches, rejected by the structuralists, became respectable sources of information for psychology. As we will mention in the next video, we will cover Binet and Whitmer. Binet, of course, going in the light of mental tests and such. But by the time of Wundt's death in 1920 and Titchener's death in 1927, their approaches to psychology had been overshadowed in the United States. By 1930, the functionalist victory was virtually complete. As we shall see later on, functionalism left its imprint on contemporary American psychology, and most significantly through its emphasis on the application of the methods and findings of psychology to the solution of practical problems.